On a quiet April morning in 1999, a moment of normal life in a London suburb was shattered so suddenly that even today, more than 20 years later, it still feels unreal, like a scene that shouldn't belong to the real world. She was just steps away from her front door. 1 second, the world was ordinary. Birds, morning air, the rhythm of a city waking up. The next, everything stopped. A single gunshot. No warning, no struggle that anyone could clearly see, no dramatic chase, just silence after impact. And the victim was someone the entire country seemed to know. Jill Dando was not just another television presenter. She was one of the most recognizable faces in Britain. Warm, composed, trusted, the kind of broadcaster viewers felt they knew personally. As the host of major BBC programs like Crime Watch, she wasn't only reporting crime, she was helping solve it, guiding the public through real investigations, asking for their eyes, their memories, their help. Which is why when news of her death broke, it didn't feel like a random crime, it felt personal. The attack happened outside her home in Fulham, West London. No forced entry, no obvious robbery, no immediate explanation that made sense. Just a targeted shot to the head on her doorstep, carried out with chilling precision before the killer vanished into the streets. Within minutes, an ordinary residential road became the center of one of the most intense murder investigations in modern British history. Police flooded the area. Neighbors were questioned, surveillance reviewed, every possible angle was examined, every detail rechecked, every movement around her home that morning replayed again and again. But the most unsettling truth was this: there were almost no answers, no clear witness who saw the killer's face, no weapon recovered, no confirmed motive, only questions, multiplying by the hour. The investigation grew rapidly into a national operation. Thousands of interviews were conducted. Officers worked through theories ranging from personal targeting to professional retaliation, even speculative links to her work on Crime Watch and public crime appeals. The idea that someone might have used her own profession as a reason to silence her began to circulate quietly, feeding public fear and fascination in equal measure. Yet, despite the scale of the inquiry, the case resisted resolution. Years later, attention turned toward a suspect, Barry George, a local man with a history of bizarre behavior and previous minor offenses, was eventually arrested and charged. In 2001, he was convicted of the murder, an outcome that, at the time, seemed to bring a sense of closure to a grieving nation desperate for answers. But closure never truly settled. The case against him rested heavily on forensic evidence that would later be challenged. Doubts began to surface. Experts questioned reliability. The certainty of conviction started to crack under scrutiny. Then came the reversal. In 2008, after a retrial, Barry George was acquitted. And just like that, the supposed solution to the mystery collapsed, leaving the original question even more haunting than before. If he didn't do it, then who did? Today, the murder of Jill Dando remains officially unsolved. Theories still circle. Investigators have revisited leads over the years, and documentaries continue to dissect every fragment of evidence, every timeline, every possibility that might explain how one of Britain's most loved television figures could be killed in daylight without a confirmed killer ever being brought to justice. But behind all the analysis, one image remains unchanged: a front door, a quiet street, and a life interrupted in an instant, without warning, without explanation, and without answers that fully satisfy the question that still echoes through time. Who pulled the trigger that morning in Fulham, and why? The morning of April 26, 1999, did not begin like something out of a tragedy. It began like any other ordinary London morning, calm, predictable, almost forgettable in the way routine life often is before everything changes. Jill Dando had already built her life around that sense of structure. Early starts, professional discipline, a career that kept her in the public eye, but also deeply connected to everyday people. She wasn't living behind layers of secrecy or security. In fact, those who knew her often described her as approachable to the point of vulnerability, someone who still carried the habits of normal life despite being one of the most recognizable faces on British television. That morning, she was at home in Fulham, West London, a quiet residential street where nothing about the surroundings suggested danger. The kind of place where neighbors might nod to each other, where mornings were filled with the soft sounds of daily routines, cars starting, doors closing, distant footsteps fading down pavements. Inside her home, there was no sign of panic, no indication that the day would become one of the most scrutinized crime scenes in British history. She prepared to leave. There was no rush, no chaos, just the normal rhythm of someone heading out to continue their day. And that is what makes what followed so difficult to comprehend, because nothing about the lead-up warned of what was about to happen. No visible tension, no known threats that had escalated to urgency, just a routine exit from a home she had likely walked in and out of countless times before. As she stepped outside, the world around her remained unchanged. The street was still alive in its usual, unremarkable way. People were going about their lives. No one had any reason to believe that within seconds, this location would become the center of an international investigation. And then it happened. A single gunshot. Not a series of chaotic shots, not a drawn-out struggle, just one precise, devastating moment that cut through the normality of the morning like a rupture in reality itself. The attacker did not linger. There was no dramatic confrontation, no visible hesitation. Whoever was responsible acted with speed and purpose, as if the moment had been planned down to the second. In an instant, the assailant disappeared, blending back into the streets as though they had never been there at all. For those nearby, the shock came in fragments, confusion first, then realization, then panic. A scene that should never have existed was suddenly real, unfolding in front of ordinary people who had simply been living their day. Emergency services were called almost immediately. The response was rapid, but even speed cannot undo what has already been done. When help arrived, the focus shifted instantly from rescue to investigation, and within minutes the quiet residential street was transformed into a sealed-off zone of forensic examination. Tape went up, officers moved in controlled urgency, every inch of the area became significant, every surface, every footprint, every possible trace of movement was treated as a potential clue. But even at that early stage, something deeply troubling was already becoming clear. There was no obvious escape route that made sense, no clear eyewitness account that fully captured the attacker's identity, no immediate weapon recovery that could anchor the investigation to a straightforward conclusion. Just fragments, conflicting details, and an overwhelming sense that this was not going to be a quick resolution. As news began to spread, shock quickly turned into disbelief. The victim was not anonymous. This was not a distant, unfamiliar name buried in a police report. This was someone the public felt they knew personally. A familiar face from television, a voice associated with trust, calm, and authority. And now that voice was gone.
Within hours, the scale of the investigation expanded dramatically. Senior detectives were brought in. The area was locked down further. The initial theory that this might be a spontaneous act of violence began to fade as investigators studied the precision of the attack. Everything about it suggested intent, focus, control. Attention quickly turned to the question of motive. Why her? Was she targeted because of who she was publicly, her role in journalism, her involvement with crime-related programming that placed her in contact with sensitive cases and public appeals, or was there something far more personal that had never been visible to the public eye? Detectives began mapping her life in detail, her routines, her recent work, her public appearances, her interactions, even the smallest fragments of information that might reveal a pattern or threat that had gone unnoticed. But the deeper they looked, the more complicated the picture became. There were no obvious enemies, no confirmed threats that stood out as credible or immediate, no simple explanation waiting to be uncovered. Instead, there was a growing sense of contradiction between her public visibility and her apparent personal safety. At the same time, the investigation began expanding outward into wider possibilities. Officers examined whether the attack could have been random, whether it could have been a case of mistaken identity, or whether it was connected to something far more calculated and deliberate than anyone initially imagined. Every theory opened new questions, every lead seemed to split into further uncertainty. And as the hours passed, the pressure mounted, not just to find who did it, but to understand how something so precise could happen in such a public yet uncontrolled environment and still leave so little behind. By the end of that first day, the crime scene had been thoroughly processed, evidence was collected, catalogued, and removed for analysis. The street began to slowly return to its physical normality, but nothing about it felt normal anymore, because everyone who had been there knew something had changed forever. And as investigators worked through the night, one truth was already becoming unavoidable. This was not going to be a quick resolution. This was the beginning of something much larger. A case that would not just challenge police resources, but challenge the very idea of certainty itself.
By the time night settled over Fulham, the street had already been transformed into something unrecognizable from the place it had been just hours earlier. The warmth of an ordinary London morning had been replaced by floodlights, police tape, and the quiet tension of a city trying to make sense of something that refused to make sense at all. Inside the investigation rooms, the pressure was already building. Every major department involved in the case was now working at full capacity. Statements were being collected, timelines were being reconstructed, and every movement around the victim's final hours was being broken down into fragments of seconds. Nothing was too small to ignore. A passing vehicle, a distant sound, a neighbor's half-remembered detail that might not feel important until later. But despite the scale of the response, the core problem remained unchanged. There was still no clear suspect, and worse, no clear pattern. Jill Dando was not someone who lived a secretive or isolated life. She was visible, active, and deeply embedded in public work. That made the investigation both easier and harder at the same time. Easier because her life was well documented, harder because so many people had access to her world in one form or another. Detectives began narrowing their focus on her routines in the weeks leading up to her death. Who had she spoken to recently? Who had she met professionally? Had there been anything unusual, anything that might have seemed minor at the time but carried meaning in hindsight? Her schedule revealed nothing immediately alarming. No known threats escalating into action, no documented warnings that suggested urgency, and yet the nature of the attack itself told a very different story, because this was not random violence, it carried intention. That realization began to reshape the direction of the entire inquiry.
As forensic teams continued their work, attention shifted towards reconstructing the exact mechanics of the attack, the position of the body, the trajectory of the shot, the likely distance between the victim and the shooter at the moment of impact. Each detail added another layer to the emerging picture, but not clarity. If anything, the precision of the act made it more disturbing. This was someone who knew what they were doing, or at least someone who had planned carefully enough to make it appear that way. Meanwhile, investigators started widening their scope beyond the immediate neighborhood. CCTV coverage in 1999 was limited compared to modern standards, but available footage from surrounding streets, transport routes, and local businesses was collected and reviewed. Officers combed through hours of grainy recordings, searching for anything that might stand out: a person moving against the flow of normal activity, a vehicle parked too long, a figure appearing where they should not be. Most of it led nowhere. Still, every dead end had to be followed, because in a case like this, even absence could be meaningful. Public reaction was beginning to intensify as well. News of the killing spread rapidly across the country. The shock was not just about the violence, it was about the identity of the victim. She was familiar, trusted, someone who had appeared in people's homes through their television screens, delivering news, presenting stories, even guiding the public through real criminal investigations on Crime Watch. And now she had become the subject of one. The emotional impact was immediate and widespread. People began questioning safety in ways that felt deeply personal. If someone so visible, so careful could be attacked in such a way, then what did that mean for everyone else? Inside the investigation, that pressure translated into urgency. Detectives were now dealing with not only a murder inquiry, but a national expectation of answers. As the first full day turned into the second, attention began to shift towards a more difficult phase of the investigation: motive exploration. This was where things became even more complex, because there was no simple narrative forming, no obvious personal vendetta emerging from her known relationships, no financial disputes, no public feud that had escalated into violence. Instead, the case began to spread outward into broader speculation. Some investigators considered whether her high public profile could have played a role. Others looked at whether her work on crime-related programming could have exposed her to individuals capable of obsession, resentment, or retaliation. And then there were the more uncertain theories, ideas that lacked confirmation but could not be dismissed outright at that stage. Each theory added weight to the investigation, but also increased its fragmentation. Nothing aligned cleanly. Everything overlapped without resolving. At the same time, early inconsistencies in witness accounts began to emerge. Descriptions of movements near the scene varied. Timelines did not always match perfectly. Some details contradicted others in subtle but important ways. It was not enough to build a suspect profile, but it was enough to complicate certainty. And in a case already defined by limited physical evidence, uncertainty was dangerous, because it meant every interpretation carried equal weight. By the end of the second phase of early investigation, detectives were facing a difficult truth. They had a highly targeted killing, but no confirmed direction pointing towards who could have carried it out. And as days passed, the pressure only intensified. Not just to find answers, but to ensure that no possible explanation was being overlooked, because somewhere in the noise of theories, statements, and incomplete fragments of evidence, investigators believed the truth still existed. It just hadn't revealed itself yet. And until it did, the question that now defined the entire case remained painfully unresolved. Who had watched her leave that house and decided that moment would be her last?
As the investigation deepened, the initial shock began to settle into something more dangerous: endurance. This was no longer a case driven only by urgency. It had become a sustained, grinding effort to extract meaning from fragments that refused to align into a clear story. Inside police headquarters, the focus shifted from the immediate aftermath to the structure of the event itself. Every second around the moment of the attack was being reconstructed again and again, like a film being slowed down frame by frame in search of something that had been missed the first time. But the problem remained the same. The central moment of violence was clear. Everything around it was not. Jill Dando had left her home on Gowen Avenue in Fulham that morning as part of a routine that should have been completely ordinary. Investigators confirmed the sequence of her movements up to the doorstep with reasonable certainty. What happened after that, however, became the hardest part to pin down with precision. Witness accounts suggested a brief window of confusion. Some people reported hearing a sharp sound, but were unsure what it was at first. Others only became aware something was wrong when they saw movement, distress, or commotion after the fact. In the critical seconds that mattered most, clarity was missing. That absence of clarity became one of the defining challenges of the case, because without a clean eyewitness account, the investigation leaned heavily on inference, on reconstruction rather than direct observation. Forensic teams continued analyzing every measurable detail at the scene: the position of the body relative to the doorway, the likely angle of the shot, the estimated distance between the shooter and the victim. Each calculation added structure to the event, but none of it brought identity closer. It described what happened, not who made it happen. Meanwhile, detectives expanded their work into mapping every possible route away from the scene. The surrounding streets were studied in detail, movement patterns were reconstructed using local traffic flow, pedestrian activity, and transport access points. The goal was simple in theory: identify how a person could enter, commit the act, and leave without being clearly seen. But in practice, it revealed something unsettling. There were multiple viable escape routes, too many possibilities, not enough restriction, and that in itself widened the scope of uncertainty. As days turned into weeks, public attention remained intense. Media coverage followed every development, every rumor, every partial lead. The victim's identity meant the case could never fade into obscurity. It stayed in the national conversation, constantly resurfacing with new angles and renewed speculation. In parallel, investigators began a more detailed examination of her professional life, not because there was evidence pointing directly to it, but because nothing else was producing answers. Her work on programs like Crime Watch was re-examined carefully, particularly the kind of cases she had presented and the visibility that came with appealing to the public for information in serious criminal investigations. It was a difficult line to explore. There was no confirmation of any direct threat emerging from her work, but in the absence of a clear motive, every aspect of her public role had to be considered. At the same time, attention turned towards potential individuals who might have developed fixation or resentment. Investigators reviewed reports, complaints, and any prior interactions that could suggest abnormal attention. Most of what they found led to nothing actionable. A few concerns were noted, assessed and dismissed due to lack of evidence. Still, the case resisted simplification. And as the official inquiry progressed, an uncomfortable pattern began to form, not of certainty, but of fragmentation. Every promising line of inquiry eventually broke apart under closer inspection. Every theory generated new questions instead of resolving old ones. Then came a turning point in the early trajectory of the case. A name began circulating within investigative channels. It did not emerge from a single dramatic breakthrough, but rather from accumulated suspicion, background checks, and behavioral anomalies that caught attention during routine review. That name was Barry George.
At first, it was just another entry among many, someone living within the broader geographical area of interest, someone with a history that warranted attention, but not immediate conclusion. However, as investigators dug deeper into his background, certain inconsistencies and past behaviors began to elevate interest. He was not yet a suspect in the formal sense, but he was moving closer to that category. Statements were reviewed, movements were analyzed, past interactions were re-examined with a new lens, one shaped by the severity of the crime now under investigation. And as that scrutiny increased, so did the pressure to determine whether this direction was meaningful or misleading. Because by this stage of the investigation, one truth had become painfully clear inside the team. In a case like this, the danger was not only missing the answer, it was choosing the wrong one. And while investigators worked to separate signal from noise, the wider public continued to demand resolution, unaware of how fragile the early assumptions of the case really were. Every new lead carried weight, but none of them carried yet certainty. And somewhere in that uncertainty, the real story of what happened on that quiet Fulham street was still buried, waiting for the moment when evidence would finally connect into something solid enough to stand on. Until then, the question remained suspended in the air like a shadow that refused to disappear. Who was close enough to act and careful enough to vanish without a trace?